Hello. Let me start by saying I don't believe in curses, and I am not religious. My name is Doug, and my wife and I have struggled with our son. He has sleep problems that just came from nowhere. It all started one night. It was only a week or so ago. On the night of the first rainfall, we live in a pretty small eastern coastal town of Brigham, so when it rains, it can get pretty bad. I was at my home watching reruns of Miami Vice, while my wife was getting dinner ready. We live in my childhood home, a single story. I had our youngest daughter in her walker when the rain started to hit the window. That was when Charlotte and I realized we didn't know where Finn, our 10-year-old, was. We called all over from his friends' parents to the school. No one knew. My wife started to blame me while I was getting my coat on to go. At this point, I was a few beers down the chute when I opened the door, ignoring my wife's rant. And there he was. He stood there on the front step, drenched. I don't know how long he was there, or what. I just took my son in and hugged him. I carried him inside and put a towel around him, trying to warm him up. My wife started to draw a bath through her cloudy eyes. I asked him where he was, and why no one knew where he went. He just said, "I wanted to go to the woods." I didn't find anything wrong with this. I used to go to the same woods all the time when I was a kid, with my brother, and with friends. Near the creek. He nodded. "Did you see anything?" My boy just looked up at me, his blue lips barely hanging onto his face, and shook his head. Something red. I didn't know what the hell that meant, so I helped walk him over to the bathroom where my wife was, and she started to take care of him. I just walked back towards the family room, aghast at what I allowed to happen. I didn't know what to do, so I just thanked whoever was listening in my head. My wife and I knew that he was probably going to get a cold or something worse from this, so we kept an ear open and barely slept ourselves that night. His coughs kept us up as we took shifts while sitting nearby. Some were empty like a wheeze scratching the walls of his throat while they escaped. Others were full of gunk and sludge, followed by him rolling over and spitting the excess in the nearby trash can. It was around 5 a.m. when I tapped my wife out, letting her go to sleep for an hour or so. I sat there after brewing some coffee and listened to Finn go through hell. In times like this, it's good to have a wife who's as caring as Charlotte. When I have to go to work, I know that she will be here with my kids. I was slightly nodding off around 5:30 before I awoke. Something was off. I didn't know why yet, but I could feel it. That was when it hit me. I was dozing off because the house was silent. I jumped up from my seat and ran into my son's room. The door slammed against the wall as I dove at my son, fearing the worst, swearing at myself for not taking him to the emergency room. But as I got to him, I realized his chest moving up and down. He was fine. He was better than fine. He looked as peaceful as ever sleeping, lying on his side, his left hand under his head. Even my landing on him barely made him budge. I scratched my head looking around. When I looked in his garbage off the edge of the bed, where I imagined seeing a mound of phlegm and mucus, but nothing was in there. Nothing at all. Thinking I lost my mind, I just shook my head and walked out of his room. Over a day or so, Finn was all back to normal health and at school. A few nights later, it happened. I got up out of bed around 1 a.m. I was the one having trouble that night. I walked into our kitchen and opened the fridge, reaching into the case and opening the tab on the side so it wouldn't crack too loud and wake my wife. I took a long sip of it, following it with a loud breath. The cool lager put my mind at ease as I turned from the fridge. He stood there. Half covered by the door frame, he watched me. I put the can behind my back, failing to hide what he clearly already saw. "What's up, buddy? Why do you drink so late, Dad?" I just shrugged, bringing the tone down in the conversation to again not wake my wife. I put my finger up to my mouth to shush him a little. I opened my mouth to try to answer. "Do you drink because of Kevin?" My answer got caught in my throat before it could exit. He blinked at me, twice. Then he turned around and went into his room, leaving me speechless. I could only clench my teeth together, hidden behind my cheeks. I drank the last bit of my beer and couldn't help but open another. I barely told Finn about Kevin. I barely told Charlotte. I kept it in my head, and just with my parents. I still never understood. Kevin was my little brother. I don't know if I wanted to get into it. But over the last few nights, I need to talk about it. See, Finn has gotten worse. Not coughing or anything, he hasn't been right. He just hasn't slept at all. It was bad. Charlotte found him one night. She checked on him just slipping her head through the cracked door. He was in bed, but sitting straight up. Staring at the wall, he didn't even turn to her when she called him. He was in a trance, mouth open, his breathing in deep and out shallow. She ran over to him, rubbing his back. His breathing got better, but his eyes stayed on the wall. When she came to our room and told me, I had nothing to say. I chalked it up to maybe a horror show or movie he caught when we weren't paying attention. I told her that I was going to check on him as she got into bed. I left my room, but on my way to his, something overtook me. I couldn't have him ask more about Kevin, at least not yet. I turned into my kitchen and grabbed my bottle of vodka from above the fridge and walked out into my garage. I only took a few pulls, but it was hard to keep down. I got so used to just beer. I walked into my home after getting a good bit of the bottle down. I put it back, grabbed the OJ carton out of the fridge, and took a few sips out of it. That's when I heard the giggling coming from the crack of Finn's room. It was light and soft, but it creeped the hell out of me. I decided to try to look in the room myself. The dark room was only lit by the window above his bed, but he wasn't in it. The sheets and covers were thrown to the side. Then I heard the giggles. There were two of them. My head whipped over towards my right, where Finn stood by his wall. I turned to the lights on in fear, as Finn slowly turned to me. I looked in the room for a second. "Go to bed, Finn." He nodded and slowly walked back to his bed. I shut off the light after taking one more look in the room. I couldn't sleep that night. Not a minute. Because before I turned his lights on, I could have sworn I saw a hand reaching and touching my son's face. The next morning, I was out and about. I forgot what for. But on my way home, I saw the flashing lights. I saw the ambulance rush past me out of my neighborhood. I feared the worst and sped home. I found my wife on the porch, crying on the phone. I jumped out of the car and held her, asking her what happened. She told me this verbatim. She was doing laundry, and our daughter was in the living room bouncing. She went to bring folded laundry into Finn's room, hoping that he was napping and catching some sleep. She didn't even knock. She just barely opened it. She saw him in there. She saw our boy standing in the center of his room, arched backward, his head almost touching his calves. She couldn't breathe as Finn's right arm started to rise in the air. That's when she noticed that he wasn't standing. His feet were inches off the ground. When she screamed, that was when he fell. I just took my wife into my arms, holding her there, confused as all hell. Hoping this one moment could last forever, before we would have to find out what was wrong with our boy. By her words, he had to be paralyzed with a broken back. I then ushered her into the car, running back inside and grabbing our baby girl, before we were off to the hospital. So, now it's time to talk about my brother Kevin. I think it's time that I bring up Kevin. Kevin was my younger brother. He was only 8 years old when he got sick. At first, it came off as the flu. He was bedridden and only missed a few days of school. I remember it like it was yesterday, because frankly, it was all so odd. Kevin got home late the day before his sickness. He was always a sprite and fun kid, always looking for an adventure even at a young age. I always took him places too, because he could keep up with 13-year-old me on any bike ride. He had this gummy smile and an infatuation with Superman. We weren't rich or anything growing up, so my mom had bought him a cheap cape from a hand-me-down store. For the next year, he always wore that cape. While he was biking down to his friend Anthony's house, I remember it always flailing in the wind, as if he were flying in the air. After he got sick, I don't remember him putting it on ever again. He came home that day. From what I remember my mother telling me, rest her soul, that he walked into the house for the first time in complete silence. He got ready for bed without eating anything, and that was it. In that bed, he stayed for days. I would always knock to see if he wanted to do anything, and he would refuse. During those days, I started to feel off. I woke up one night in complete sweat, confused, and not remembering my dream that I had. I left my bed and went into my kitchen. I poured a cup of water and chugged it, as it was so cold it burned my throat. I took a second, and then went to go back to bed, when I heard something soft coming from inside Kevin's room, behind the closed door. I stopped and put my ear to it. It sounded like he was talking to himself. It sounded like he was maybe giggling. Then it sounded like two voices talking at the same time. They overlapped each other, but no distinct words were actually being stated. I held my ear there longer, maybe to get a nugget of information. Then the voices stopped. A coldness drafted up my spine, a bead of sweat down my nose. "Dougie," the voices said. I backed away fast and ran into my room, clawing into my bed and sitting there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. It took only 20 or so minutes when I started to hear creaks from outside my room. I stared at the door, terrified of my own little brother, scared of how he knew it was me outside his room. But when I saw the shadows cross underneath my door, I saw two sets of legs, just standing there. No knocks on my door, no whispers, nothing. Those legs stood there, motionlessly for 10 minutes. Before they turned back to his room. I just stared and stared all night. From there, things took a turn for the worse. Kevin slid into a brain coma due to a lack of oxygen a few days later. He then died a week after that. Fluid in his lungs built up to the point of suffocation, but the doctors never detected it. It always seemed like he was breathing normally to everyone that checked. He was only 8 years old. It was odd too, because after he got sick, I remember his buddy Anthony started to miss school as well. I always hated myself for being afraid of him. His saying Dougie outside of his door could have been a call for help. It could have meant anything. But young me mistook it for something frightening, something that was meant to warn me to stay away from my only brother. That's why I bought my home, my old childhood home, as a reminder of my brother and what he meant to me. I still keep it deep down, though. I rarely talk about it to my wife, and never to my son. Kevin almost completely died when my parents passed away. The only people that really might remember him are Anthony and I. We don't really speak. I say hi whenever I walk into him at the liquor store. He has been looking worse. But we both know, and we both remember. When Charlotte and I got to the hospital, they were running tests on Finn. Finn never looked more alive. He was sitting up in his chair and smiling with the nurses. My wife, through tears, looked as confused as everyone else did once they saw her. She ran up and held our son in the brightest embrace, like the first time she ever held him. I stood there. My wife doesn't lie. My wife doesn't overimpose anything. How did she see what she saw? How is it that now I am being told that Finn is doing great and that we can take him back in only a few hours? I insisted that they watch him and take care of him for at least a night. But they needed the bed in case of an emergency. I was at that point done with the conversation and didn't want to expedite it further, maybe upsetting my wife and son who have both been through a lot. We got home that night, and I carried my son into the house while my wife carried our daughter. We laid them both to bed. I told my wife to call the police if anything happened, but that I needed to go somewhere. We had a light argument. Before I told her that I had to go to the creek. That was the last place Finn was before he got sick. She didn't want to hear it, but she knew that it wasn't the worst decision. Before I left, she stopped me. She asked me if I believed her, and if I didn't think she was crazy for what she told me. I told her, of course, that I was as confused as she was. I kissed her, and then I left. Driving up to the woods at night can be daunting. Darkness. It was even worse because it took everything that I had to not pull into any of the bright signs above the bars that I passed. Drink it away. Drink the thought of Kevin, the thought of my home, and the thought of anything all away. But I pushed on. Now that I made my decision, I moved into the bush, through the trees, and into the dirt. Hindsight was 20/20 because I forgot a flashlight, but I knew my way. Even though it has been 20 or so years since I last came down here, this place has been sunken deep into my soul. I made it to the low-tide creek and stood over it on the bank. It was filled with leaves. It couldn't have been any more than a few inches deep. This creek used to be big for fishing. I barely heard anything other than the light water going against rocks. No squirrels, no owls, nothing but the creek. I looked around and realized that my hope was all but lost. What was I even expected to find here, that I came all this way? Left my wife at home with our kids. I turned and walked the creek a bit. Looking up and down, the big bright moon cut its way through the tree limbs and guided my trail a little. Then I swore I felt it. Something grabbed my ankle as I turned and fell down into the water. The water didn't expect me, and I smack against it. My head hit the edge of a rock, and I stayed in the water for a second, using it to cover my scream of agony. I then pulled myself up and looked around. I swore I felt something grab me, that I didn't just catch the lip of the bank, that I wasn't that clumsy. I swear it. I clung to the dirt as I crawled up the side of the bank, hoping that my head wasn't bleeding too badly. I got to the edge and looked over. It was then that I saw it. I saw what Finn saw. It was red, but it was covered. I got out of the bank and ran up to it. I looked down, and my heart sank. It couldn't be, it just wouldn't make sense. But I knelt down, moving everything that was on top of it, all the leaves and broken branches, and picked it up in my hands. I knew the material, and the way that it would move in the air, as if it were just yesterday. I was holding back tears as I looked down at Kevin's old cape. A feeling overflowed me, and my head snapped as if I had been plugged into a computer. Everything came to me at once, every memory, every feeling, why I was so awkwardly terrified that night with Kevin. I ran through the trees back to the road, back to my car, and hopefully back to safety. I just hoped through the pain of my grip on my brother's scarlet cape. I drove home in silence. The lights of the bars hadn't lost their appeal. They shined even brighter. But I pushed ahead. I needed to get back to Charlotte, to my wife, to my son, and to my daughter. I pulled onto the driveway. I walked up, opening the door. Charlotte jumped at the door when I walked in. She was wide awake on the couch. I looked at her, with every word on the tip of my tongue ready to spill. But just one glance at her was enough. I think she saw something was wrong. I hope she did. Because I stood there and I wept. I fell to my knees, as I couldn't hold back anymore. She stood up, and this time, she held me while I didn't have the strength myself. When I touched that cape, it took over and I couldn't let go as much as I wanted to. All of the memories that I pushed out that I didn't care for flooded back into my mind. They clenched on with knives and bit with teeth as they seeped back into my brain. I then told Charlotte about my last day with Kevin before he slipped into his coma. I was in the living room watching television when I heard him coughing from his room. I went to go check on him, and there I saw him sitting straight up in his bed, like he was waiting for me. I went and sat at his side. "How are you feeling, Kevin?" "Good. How are you?" I nodded at him. "Dougie, I never got to tell you something." "What's that?" "Well, it's just that I am worried for you." "Why are you worried?" Something in the corner of my eye caught my attention, and I looked down at his trash. Inside the bin laid a large mound of black gunk, which must have been a week's storage. Because your son is going to die just like I will. I looked at him. It wasn't my brother. His eyes were flooded with black sewage as it dripped and creased through his face. His teeth were rotted to the gums gray to the gills. I jumped as he looked up at the ceiling, and his mouth opened. Then, like a fountain blackness, canvassed out of his mouth and to the ceiling. I looked at it for a moment and fell to the ground, knocking me out. I awoke on the couch. It took every bit of strength of mine to go back to the room to find any evidence of the accident happening. But I walked inside of the room, and it looked just as clean as when I entered prior. I waited for my parents to get home, and when they did, I told them about it. Don't rile your brother up with these hysterics. Your mother has been going through so much with all of this. Why bring up this? You need to stop watching those horror movies with your friends. That is all I got. I stayed silent. I thought it was all in my head. I remember it so clearly now, because after touching that cape, it all became so clear. Everything aligned correctly. That night, when I heard Kevin whispering in his room, and when he stood outside my door, that was 3 days after he slipped into a coma. If anyone lives or has lived in Brigham, if anyone knows anything about the creek in the woods, if anyone has any idea what the hell might be happening to my son, please and by all means reach out. My family is so lost. I am terrified for my son, Finn. Because he collapsed today, we had to bring him into the hospital. And about an hour ago, the doctors told me that he was building a large amount of fluid in his lungs, more than the normal case of pneumonia. I'm afraid what happened to my brother might happen to him. If anyone can, please help us.